Good to
Well, hello
know.
everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our last, certainly but not least, Daniels Fund public lecture this semester. My name is Chin Zhu. I'm assistant professor in humanities, arts, and social sciences. I'm co-directing the Daniels Fund program Professional Ethics Education with my colleague Sandy Woodsum, who is actually currently busy with a lot of registration issues at home. I'm sorry she couldn't come. She said she would love to come. Today, we're very happy to have uh, Dr. Emily York and also Dr. Shannon Conley, two colleagues I've known for a long time.
We go
Uh,
back like over a decade, Jen.
yes, the first time I came to know Shannon was, if I remember correctly,
Yeah.
was 2008 or 2009
Oh
when
my gosh, that's right.
both of us were involved in a NSF project that embedded scholars and actually graduate students in laboratories over the world. So
Hmm.
I think each of us actually studied two laboratories to understand responsible innovation and engineering practice. And
Hmm.
at that time, I had no clue what anthropology was, what economic studies was. I had a lot of hard time.
Learned it
and
on the fly.
and I think Shannon, you visited two laboratories. One was in Canada, the other one was in UK, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the first time I came to know Emily was, if I remember correctly, was 2017. Both of us attended. Uh, there is a there was a winter school
Oh, yeah.
on ethics of emerging technologies at Arizona State University. That was my first time I met Emily. I really admire the work done by Emily and Shannon, who worked so hard um, to how to should I say, who actually worked so hard to create engaging integrated ethics pedagogies in science and engineering. And they both belong to this school with a very unique name. It's called School of Integrated Sciences and James Madison University, and they both co-direct the STS Futures Lab. Um, Let me say a couple of things about the two speakers today. Emily York is an assistant professor and co-director of the STS Futures Lab in the School of Integrated Sciences at James Madison University. Her work focuses on the socio-political and ethical dimensions of high-tech innovation, interdisciplinarity and expertise, STS pedagogy, and knowledge production and intersection of research, teaching, and public engagement. She earned her PhD in communication and science studies from the University of California, San Diego. She's an associate editor for engineering studies at Engaging Science and Technology Society. Shannon Conley earned her PhD in political science for Arizona State University. She's currently associate professor in the School of Integrated Sciences and James Madison University and co-director of the STS Futures Lab. Her research focuses on responsible innovation, ethics, and governance of new and emerging technologies in context of reproductive technologies. She also conducts research around expertise acquisition and is a member of the Studies of Experience Expertise community. She has particular interest in developing a scholarly community focused on STS as a critical pedagogy. Um, this talk is made possible by the Daniels Fund, and we really appreciate the support from the Daniels Fund and certainly the support from other academic departments on campus and the university. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Emily and Shannon for this wonderful talk.
Thank you
Thank
so much.
you.
What a nice introduction. We're just so appreciative that you guys invited us to join you and that you've made time in your evening to be here with us. We started developing this creative anticipatory ethical reasoning, I guess, or maybe around 2017, 3 years ago. It's very much still in development. We are not sure if there are undergraduates present tonight, but we were planning for possibly faculty, graduate students, and undergraduate students. So we tried to speak to everybody who we thought might be with us. Do feel free to interrupt with questions and comments and clarifications. That'll probably help keep us all awake. And our goal is really just to go over the basic framework of CAER, and really invite you to begin imagining with us how you might adapt it, or take parts of it, do whatever that you could see this being useful in your context. So we tried to elaborate a lot of different contexts and experiments that we've gone over. So we'll go through that. Get to the right screen. There we go. So we did create a Google Drive folder that you can access either by the link or also holding your phone up to that QR code. And there are both the slides as well as some different assignments, templates, worksheets, etc., that you can access now or later as you wish. So I wanted to speak first just to the context of development before we get into how we've been using it. And there are a lot of different interlapping goals that we are trying to address with this, but I think one way to sort of boil it down is to draw from Jasanoff's 3 myths of innovation in her book, The Ethics of Innovation, which is to think about technological determinism, technocracy, and unanticipated consequences. These are each things that we see as being highly connected with questions of ethics and things that we are trying to address in the social context courses that we are in. So just to back up, he mentioned that we're in the School of Integrated Sciences. Both of us teach in Integrated Science and Technology, which is an ABET accredited interdisciplinary applied science program. So they're not engineering students, but they are applied STEM students. And both of us are bringing STS, social context, and ethics into that curriculum. So that's the context. And then these are some of the things that we find ourselves trying to engage students with while also trying to engage ethics. We also are focused on trying to cultivate moral imagination. So we have found that although there's a lot of creativity and a lot of entrepreneurial creativity in the spaces that we're in, a lot of us don't have that much practice really imagining different kinds of futures and forms of life and how these things might be related to new technologies. And so cultivating that is actually part of developing this habit of mind. And then because we're in the STEM space, we're also thinking about this in terms of critical participation. So how do we engage with our students and our colleagues in ways that really respect where they're coming from, where we're learning from each other. And we're also bringing that critical perspective that we bring from STS in trying to do that in a way that's really productive. How do we take the enthusiasm for innovation and push that toward responsible innovation in ways that really get taken up? How do we, drawing on Karen Barad, how do we get all of our participants, whether they're students or colleagues, to always be thinking about science as part of doing science, not as something that's separate from doing science? And then we're also always in a context where we're engaging these terms like hands-on, real world, laboratory, right? This is what our students are looking for. And so as we tried to figure out how to do this well, we were also thinking about that desire to do hands-on learning, to do things that seemed very real world, applicable. And as Shannon will elaborate later, requests for a laboratory and whether we had a laboratory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so essentially the CAER Framework and the STS Futures Laboratory, so STS stands for Science, Technology, and Society, laboratory almost co-evolved together. So as Emily and I were, essentially beginning our careers at James Madison in this very STEM-focused space, we often had requests from our students that were interested in working with us more. Do you have a laboratory? Do you have a laboratory? And the answer was, well, sadly, no, we don't. But around 2017, as Emily mentioned, we began having conversations with 2 of our students who were involved in an autonomous vehicles capstone project where they were developing a 1/8 scale, essentially autonomous vehicle. And they were actually interested in presenting at 4S, which is one of the big STS conferences, as well as SNET as well. And so we began meeting with these students on a weekly basis, and we started reading, various STS work, such as Langdon Winter's Forms of Life, learning about design fiction, you know, and really just, you know, it became a space of engagement and bringing the technical, you know, into, you know, a space of humanities, and there began to be a lot more overlap. And so now, and I'll expand on that more later, as Emily mentioned, but now we applied for and actually got a semi-permanent space in our engineering building, where we can actually engage in very large hands-on creative projects that include both, you know, 2D and 3D models, virtual reality, stuff like that. And so you can see the picture on the left. That's one of the snapshots of the laboratory. And so that has enabled us to expand the lab to about 15 students a semester, which has been great. So yeah, we're really excited about the direction that this is going. And we were thrilled when essentially we became recognized. We were given space, you know, like our scientific colleagues, which was a very big deal for us to have that credibility and that space.
And what you can see in the picture to the right, we're happy to talk about it more if you have any, I don't know to what extent this is pertinent for you all, but we started doing all of these things around CAER, and we started taking pictures, and then we put together these diagrams to show different uses of space as part of our space proposal to request and justify having a set space, and that seemed to be pretty effective. So yeah, so as Shannon was saying, the lab and this framework were really developing together. And in fact, the workshop that Shin talked about at ASU was also part of this, because CAER is really just scenario analysis, design fiction, and ethical reasoning. And we didn't invent any of these things, right? We're just creatively blending these together in ways that really help us to engage participants in anticipatory ethical reasoning. So I'll briefly touch on each of these, and then we'll take it from there. So scenario analysis is a foresight practice. It's really not about prediction, but it's mostly for planning, although we don't really use it for planning so much. So going back to those three aspects from Jasanoff that we were talking about, one way that it helps us to address technocracy is through the built-in stakeholder analysis that's part of doing scenario analysis, understanding who the different stakeholders are and what their perspectives might be, and doing that with a mind toward interpretive flexibility, thinking about how the object at hand, whether it's a technology or a socio-technical system, is going to have different meanings for different stakeholders, and guiding our students to really think critically about who and what are included and excluded when we're doing that kind of preliminary work. And then it helps us to address technological determinism, because we are trying to understand the different kinds of social and technical and political and economic and legal factors that might be really important in shaping a particular trajectory. So it's a really nice grounded way for guiding participants toward recognizing the contingencies of technological development. The snapshot here is from a bioethics class, where we'll come back to this, but this was students basically in one class session after they had already been doing work together, doing some research and analysis of IVF, going through a pretty quick scenario analysis activity together to think about these different kinds of drivers and to think about these different stakeholders, and then to start thinking about different kinds of scenarios. And so one of the ways that it helps to address the so-called myth of unanticipated consequences is by helping participants recognize the gaps between maybe their ideal or their intention with the technology, that hope that it's going to benefit society and solve problems, juxtaposed with various ways it might actually play out. And that really seems to raise new questions and provocative thinking about the kinds of things that might flow, and not in a way that's deterministic, but in a way that's related to their questions about technology. Mm-hmm. do you want to say about the design fiction?
Yeah, of course. This is one of my favorite parts. So often we will blend scenario analysis together with design fiction, although it's of course possible to do design fiction as its own activity. But essentially what design fiction is it's a combination of design prototyping, design thinking, and merging 2D and 3D types of art. But the goal is not to create some new shiny, technology that, draw some new shiny technology that we put up on a pedestal and we're like, wow, look at it, and it's all of its glistening glory. Instead, it is to make it, the picture that you can see on the slide is a perfect example of what we're going for with design fiction. So you can see that there's this old rusting can of, essentially it's a nanobot pesticide, but it's just kind of resting, on the junk shelf with everything else. But you can begin making extrapolations about this particular world, what life is like in this particular world, given this particular artifact that has been created. What is everyday life for people like that? And it begins stimulating one and our students to think about creating narrative, creating story around these artifacts, which are artifacts essentially for interrogating, in terms of social and ethical types of issues that might, happen in potentially plausible futures. So the way I like to describe design fiction to my students relates to our cell phones. You can see Arizona State, go Devils. But if we were thinking 20 years ago, we were doing some scenario analysis on design fiction around cell phone technology, what might a design fiction look like? And so I get my students to think about, okay, what if we take the sparkly, which is actually a sparkly cell phone, off of its pedestal and put it into our daily lives. So, thinking about how it engages with us as a form of life, as Langdon Winter would say, how it's part of our everyday life. A design fiction snapshot might be someone texting, for example, about meeting for dinner, or it might be, a sketch of an image of cell phones scattered around our student tables or student pods within the classroom. It's not uncommon for our cell phones to just be like lying out there, but we want to think about it as commonplace, taking the technology off of its pedestal and really thinking about how it is intersecting with all different elements of society. So what is it like in the everyday? So yeah, I think that's all I have to say about.
Yeah. So importantly, if a design fiction wouldn't just be a drawing of a cell phone.
Yes.
And a design fiction of an autonomous vehicle wouldn't just be a picture of a car, right? It's trying to get into questions about norms. And what's interesting about that in part is that it really moves away from just thinking about utopian or dystopian thinking. We're really trying to guide participants towards something that's a little bit more nuanced and just raises really interesting questions about how norms might shift in relation to, not just as an effect of. And then in terms of the framework, we're also moving toward, ethical reasoning as an ongoing practice, but we're actually agnostic about what the framework is. Sorry, Shannon, that was your slide, but I talked over.
Okay.
So we'll talk about what we often use, which is an 8-key question approach developed at JMU, but you could substitute in anything that you're doing in terms of your goals for whatever your learning objectives are related to ethics. It could be other frameworks. It could be, you could go very deeply into a particular kind of ethical framework. So it's not really essential to, it doesn't have to be one specific thing.
Yeah, and just to quickly go back, Emily, so you can see the students are actually holding up a picture of a collaborative design fiction that they put together, and this was part of a workshop utilizing these tools that we'll talk about a little bit later. regarding infrastructure in Nepal. Design fiction can take many forms. It can be, 3D clay models. It can be, kind of collected parts from a Goodwill, or it can be as simple as drawings on a poster paper as well. Just to kind of touch back on the autonomous vehicles case study that I was alluding to a little bit earlier. So here on the left-hand side are actually our two undergraduates presenting at 4S 2017. So 2017, I guess that was the year that it all happened for us. So they were actually presenting their essentially their blending of technical work with STS approaches at 4S. And so it was a process for them as they were engaging in, what they actually came to term as the STS Lab. There was, a bit of a disconnect at first in terms of, what's happening in the lab is happening in the CS lab. And, there's these little computer technical parts that I'm having to work with, whether it's a Raspberry Pi or something else, and there's coding that needs to happen. And then we go to the STS lab, and then we're talking about forms of life and stuff like that. But eventually those walls, as Chase acknowledged in the quote on the other slide, they ended up breaking down. So this is Chase in the middle, and then on the right-hand side is an actual design fiction that Chase created regarding autonomous vehicles. And you can see that he's really playing with the idea of direction in terms of autonomous vehicles. You're not really sure which way the cars are going. The wheels are almost like balls, and so it can move in different directions. And this is showing like a snippet of what he imagined life might look like on a daily basis, in terms of imagining futures around AVs.
One of the things that he articulated that I've subsequently heard many students articulate when they're doing the design fiction, that is part of why I think it's such an important element, is that there's something about the process of creating the design fiction, whether it's a quick drawing or a fancy drawing, he happened to have an artistic bent, it doesn't have to be art, or whether it's trying to build something or prototype something, there's something that happens in the process of trying to make that slows people down and starts raising new questions. So he didn't sit down to draw this with the idea of thinking about orientation. That was something that emerged as he started really imagining and developing his picture. And we've heard that over and over again with other students.
We also have a question from our very own Beth Reddy. So Beth is interested, so she says, we've noted some of our touchstones and inspirations for the work. She's interested in hearing whether and how we introduce students to key literatures, and maybe more broadly, how you think about ways you're teaching your students to think versus how you are thinking. Okay, yeah, so in terms of the ethical reasoning component, what is nice about this particular element of the CAER framework is that you can make it as I don't want to say as intense as possible, but you could spend many weeks on, so for example, Nussbaum's capabilities approach, flourishing societies, et cetera. You might be taking a disability studies approach and exposing students to thinking about, how might stakeholders from disability communities be affected by development of autonomous vehicles, and might they have a say in that? So you can take as much or as little time as you would like to expose students to relative literatures, but I personally think that it's very helpful to introduce them to some basic STS stuff around Langdon Winner's Forms of Life, Technologies as Forms of Life. Even if you don't give them the whole reading, but giving them some relevant quotes just to kind of help orient them, I think is really important. But the nice thing is you can really customize this to what you're trying to do. So, you know, the students in this particular case study with autonomous vehicles and you know, STS, were essentially taking an STS class with us while also essentially doing a hands-on computer science class. And so they're getting all of this, you know, literature, information, teaching about the physical elements of their hands-on activity. And they're also getting a very rigorous STS education as well. And then more broadly, how you think about ways you're teaching your students to think versus how you are thinking.
I mean, you really went right to the heart of it, didn't you, Beth? This is like, these are like the challenges, right? That we're always, that are always hard, and I think we're always experimenting with. I just wanted to point out really quick, Shannon, to them that because Chase picked this quote as the quote that really spoke to him. We didn't pick this quote. This was something when he was trying to think about and putting together his talk that he was just like, wow, this quote, and he read it out to us. And I thought that that would be a nice segue to Shannon's maybe sharing her juicy quotes approach to get it, that I think addresses some part of Beth's question.
Yes. Oh my, putting me on the spot for juicy quotes. So this came out of a moment of desperation when, you know, I think the faculty and the audience have been through this at least once in their lives where, you know, the students did a really, you know, you were like, yeah, that was an awesome STS reading about, you know, AIDS activism and lay expertise and stuff like that. And, you know, you're trying to get the conversation going. You have questions, you have PowerPoints, you know, you're jumping around the room, dancing, trying to get them excited, and nothing's working. They're just staring at you, all of those eyes. And so it came in a moment of desperation in which I was like, okay, guys, we're going to open the reading back up and we're going to look for juicy quotes. So these quotes need to be laden with meaning. They need to be, you know, quotes that pop out to you, that make you ask questions, that, you know, spark creativity, that maybe spark interest to learn more. And we'll have a competition about who has the juiciest quotes. And so I always have my students in teams. And so so that's where the juiciness came from. And they get it. Like, you know, it's ridiculous. It's juicy quote. But
it's partly why I think why it's so effective though, because you haven't said pick the most like intellectually X quote or a quote that does a certain thing. When you say juicy and you just give it that like juicy expression, like it gives them, I think for me, if I can, I mean, I think it has a lot of utility, but part of it is one of the challenges I've had since I've been in a STEM space is getting students to really not only read, but really engage text.
Yeah, like
and think with text. And so even some of my best students will read, but it's like they don't want to bring the article to class. They don't necessarily want to talk about it or think with it in the ways that we would like to prompt them to. And I think that juicy quotes gets them to go back to the text. And then even just saying like, why did this pop out at you? What made it juicy? It starts cultivating a practice of thinking with the text. So that's one answer, I think, Beth, to your question about introducing them to key literatures and also trying to cultivate
create
their thinking. I also think there's no substitute for time, like having students for one class period is, you know, you can only do so much, right? And I mean, one thing that we've been experimenting with the lab is having students over like more than one semester, or with our capstone students like Chase, we're working with him for 3 semesters. So this didn't happen overnight.
Yeah, and there's so many variations you can do on the juiciness. One other exercise we do is juicy words, and that's another competition. So they have to be non-obvious words that get at the heart of some sort of element of the reading. And so I'll have all of the teams when we're doing whiteboards in person, write those juicy words up. They can't repeat, so they can't repeat, which is one of the fun things about the competition. And then essentially we'll go around and we'll talk about, well, why are these words relevant? Like, what did they signify? And for whatever reason, it sparks conversation. I've had to completely like redo classes because of the just the immensity of the conversation. It's like being in a graduate seminar almost sometimes, which is really exciting. And it all comes down to just like ridiculous words and allowing yourself to be a little comedically vulnerable. Speaking of which, very nice transition, Emily. This is a design fiction created by me because I wanted to be, a good team player with Chase and Charlie and our esteemed Dr. York, and they were all doing their own design fictions. And I was like, I can't draw. I don't have it in me, and I came up with this, and you might not realize what it is at first, and I don't blame you. But essentially, they are triangular autonomous vehicles that are stacked upon each other, and towards the left, you can kind of see like a docking station, and it's kind of like, you might almost think about it as, in current times where RVs can, rest for the night, that sort of thing, except these autonomous vehicles link together, and it's basically like, it's an autonomous vehicle hotel, and they have amenities there. But it just goes to show that you can use triangles, and it can still be design fiction, and it can be something that sparks conversation. So, yeah.
I was just going to say too, on the going to Beth's question, I do think that there's I feel that I spend a lot of, I guess I think a lot about and plan a lot for inviting students to come with me. And so knowing that they don't have to really, like yes, they have to take a couple of classes with me, but they could probably get away with doing the minimal thing and moving along. But if I really want to have an impact on them, I'm hoping that by the end of my class, they've come into my house, right? I'm like, come into my world, and that happens over a semester. So for me, it's building up. Like there's one class where I really want them to read about the Zimbabwe bush pump. It's like a super long article for them. Like for them, that's just like the longest thing ever. I build up to it and I start telling the joke, like probably by the halfway point of the semester, okay, this is going to be a really long article. But I start building it up. So by the time we get to it, I have a pretty good track record of them pushing through that article because I've been building it up and almost making fun with it. And kind of getting them to come into my house and try this thing, reading this really long article about this water pump.
They find juicy stuff.
But I try to be pretty, like, I'm always trying to decide, like, what do I actually want them to read? What parts do I want them to read? Are there other things where I can just introduce concepts and trying to and I'm always changing my mind about where that line is.
Yeah, especially, back to Beth's awesome comment, when it comes to decolonizing your syllabus as well, there has to be some intention behind it too. And I think we're all kind of learning how to do that and to, do that in a meaningful way. So it's certainly, an evolving game in terms of what the students are reading, what we're learning about ourselves, perhaps for the first time. That sort of thing.
Okay, so I think if I want to share this, I have to stop sharing the screen and then share the other screen. So just give me a second. So if you want to do this, so we thought that the next step, so we tried to introduce the concept, the inspiration. We thought just giving a little taste. Now this is just a hard-coded, very simple Google form version. But just to walk through the kind of the pathways through which it kind of provokes thought, I thought it would be useful to step through it together. So just give me a moment here. And I will share the form. You can also click on it independently. Although I realize now that I won't be able to hear you, I suppose, maybe. So
maybe entering things into the chat.
Yeah. Okay, so again, this is really simple. It's not colorful. A lot of the ways that we do this is more colorful and with pictures. This is just a little text form, but just to give more of an idea. So this is a little scenario, a CAER path with autonomous vehicles. And we're going 20 years into the future, 2040. And we want to think about why these conditions might be true in 2040 and what kind of plausible slice of life. And if you have a piece of paper and a pen, grab it because you might want to draw something. So we find that it's often helpful to begin by thinking about how old you will be. And maybe there's people who have joined us. I don't know if we have any students. Maybe there's some who will only maybe be getting close to 40. Maybe there's some of us who might be in our 60s in 20 years or beyond. I'll just go ahead and be pretty straightforward there. Okay, and then we have a couple of choices to make together. So one thing that we might consider in the future is something about vehicle use. Will we have mixed use roads, meaning there's fully autonomous vehicles without human drivers on the road, sharing the road with people who are also driving their cars? Or do we think it might be only fully autonomous vehicles, no human drivers? And I'm not sure what we should do.
Maybe folks can enter their preference in the chat and we'll...
Can people chat, or are they not allowed to in terms of the webinar? Okay, mixed use. I'm gonna, Okay, so let's go with mixed use. Interesting. So
that's on both.
Ooh, all right. Okay, we got some fully autonomous and we've got some people driving cars. Okay, and now the next thing we want to do is think about vehicle ownership. So maybe it's kind of like today where obviously not everybody has a car today, but let's just say that, in general, you might you might purchase your autonomous vehicle. Or is it in 20 years, basically nobody owns cars. It's, all rideshare, whether maybe Uber's long gone by then, but it's all rideshare. What do you guys think? Should we go with people?
America, gotta love that individual vehicle ownership.
That's what you think? Individual vehicles, my own autonomous vehicle? Individual ownership.
Let's see what the okay, individual
rideshare, individual. Okay, I'm gonna go with individual ownership. Okay, so let's see if I did this correctly. Okay, so we're in 2040. There's fully autonomous vehicles. There's people driving their own cars, and either way, predominantly people own their own vehicles. So what do you think might have happened between 2020 and 2040 that would best explain why these two things are true? People own their own vehicles and it's all mixed.
So you go ahead and plop it into the chat.
So let's just come up with several things that we think explain that. Oh. Okay, so personal expression. I like that. So it's kind of a cultural factor as well as that individualism. Yeah, AVs, let's say, when I say AV for this purposes, we'll assume is fully autonomous 5, expensive. So people can't afford it. Efficient. Although I'm going to throw in there the idea that it's actually maybe the ones that you drive that are super expensive. Because, and the reason I'm saying that is I wonder if people are driving their own vehicles, is that almost a privilege in 20 years? Because, liability insurance would probably be pretty expensive when if the autonomous vehicles are considered the safe ones. So maybe, it's the Ferraris that are What else?
That sounds a good one.
Oh, and rideshares employee benefit.
Oh wow, look at all this good stuff.
Government would subsidize AVs and the individual drivers would be, yeah. Prop 22 did pass. So you guys see where we're going with this. It starts, you can, even with just these two things, right? We're starting to kind of flesh out like maybe different things that would have led to this. We might start thinking about infrastructure, like to me, if there's both autonomous vehicles, fully autonomous, and people driving them, I'm going to say that maybe we had to do some investments in infrastructure to make that plausible. So I'm going to go with a more, maybe a liberal turn to the government. We decided to pay taxes and like build infrastructure. Sorry if that was like totally naive, but you can see how this starts developing along. So what's a good title for our scenario? We've got maybe some people are driving around their expensive cars. We've got maybe some subsidized cars.
Think of it as like a movie title.
Mixed use, and to me it seems really chaotic. And actually the autonomous vehicles, honestly, if there's people driving, I'm guessing the autonomous vehicles are kind of boring because they're going the speed limit. But the people in their Ferraris are just like,
good idea.
However they want to go.
I'm coming out of my seat. Can we call it like
So
wild?
It's like people think of AVs as being against, going to solve our traffic jams, but I'm going to say like something like AV traffic nightmare.
Could we call it Wild West / Wild West Ferrari, because the Ferraris are just going nuts.
I like that. You win. And I clearly can't spell Ferrari. Ferrari.
Oh, Escape from New
York. Ooh, yeah. So you can see how this starts getting kind of interesting. And when you're doing this in groups, so if you have multiple teams and you have multiple drivers and you have these, you can imagine that this becomes a pretty this came from New Work. A pretty high volume engaged kind of thing. And that's one thing that a point that we want to make throughout is that all of the different ways that we've tried using CAER, the one thing that's in common is that people seem to start having fun and the energy starts going up. And that isn't the same thing as learning, but it certainly helps in terms of moving along and engaging. So we find that this one is helpful, particularly bringing it back to our STEM students. Okay, so let's think about that autonomous vehicle. What are some of its standard features in this world? So we have to think about the design of it. Like I'm gonna say, I think it needs really good sensors and, to be able to deal with people who are driving.
Bumpers.
Bumpers. And if these are kind of, if it turns out that the AVs are actually, people still own them. You might own your AV, but it's just going to go into the kind of the slow lane with everybody else, which there might also be shared ones, customizable.
We're getting some good ones. Soft seats and a desk to work at.
Workspace.
Whoa, look at all this.
Seat warmers.
Ooh, yeah, you guys.
Yeah, just because people, wealthy people have their Ferraris doesn't mean they don't have also like super tricked out autonomous vehicles. So there might also be some pretty fancy ones.
Caddy knows.
Who knows me? Okay, so that can be helpful to get moving towards starting to visualize. So when we get into that forms of life, what we're really trying to get them to start thinking about, them, you, people, participants, this kind of commonplace, what's kind of ordinary. And so we do this in different ways. This could be like, what does it look like to go to work? What does it look like to talk to somebody? We might do this in relation to different stakeholders. But usually this helps us to start thinking about the everyday starts opening up new kinds of questions. And I keep thinking of those traffic jams and wishing I could buy a vehicle that could speed and move around them. Anyone else?
Motorcycles become more popular, like in like zip around with their motorcycles, are able to
I'm gonna, this is kind of the best part. Ooh, yep, you got to start working during the commute. I like that. So if you had a piece of paper, you could be starting to sketch something that would get at some everyday aspect of this. Then you might start picking some questions that might help you to start interrogating. So, if you've done stuff with scenario analysis, you know that sometimes you're going to come up with drivers that lead you towards scenarios that are less thought-provoking than others. So there is a process of kind of trying out different ones and thinking together. I find that what's really great with participants is sometimes it's the imagining together, sometimes it's the contesting, like saying, oh no, I think it would be like this, or I think it would be like that, and then trying to interrogate what makes you think that one or the other thing is plausible. And then this is another place where sometimes actually the discussion and if you say, well, you can only pick two, for example, trying to figure out which ones might be really important. And sometimes they already are thinking, you might already be thinking about some ethical issues. And so you might pick something, but sometimes it's the other way around. You might start with like, well, what kinds of issues of fairness might come up in this everyday kind of scenario? What are the outcomes here? And this is the kind of one of those cases too, where you might start thinking about how this relates to your original ideal. So often we see promises and aspirations for autonomous vehicles to address traffic, to be energy efficient, to somehow address climate change, to solve certain kinds of problems. And yet we've just imagined potentially a scenario where it really hasn't in any, at least not that problem. So you can imagine how this could kind of go both directions. I'm gonna short circuit this one. No good. So again, this is just very simplistic Google Form version that's basically hard-coded, but it starts the process. And I think that you hopefully can imagine more robust versions that might start getting you toward a whole variety. You might develop 10 different scenarios here that might raise different kinds of ethical issues. And some might just confirm what you already think is going to happen. Some might not raise very interesting questions. So it's a process. Mm-hmm. Any questions about that? I'm just going to go back to the slides.
We'll keep an eye on the chat if there's any questions. Yeah, and the nice thing about what Emily just demonstrated is you can do that in a class period. Say for example, if you want to get students used to scenario analysis, used to design fiction, it can be kind of like a warm-up, or it can just be a one and done. So there's different ways that you can use these kind of like short creative activities.
So in terms of assessing it, I would say that this is the area that we probably have the most work to do. We certainly started, and that's the basis for the article in Science, Engineering, and Ethics, Science and Engineering Ethics. I think assessing creative pedagogical innovations is notoriously challenging, especially, you've got small n qualitative types of work. That said, I think there's more that we could do, but it is difficult. The examples here, I think, gesture toward patterns that we've seen. We see students going through this process, especially if there's an opportunity to go through it in a kind of robust way, whether it's a final project or more than once in class, starting to think about different perspectives, different stakeholder perspectives, cultivating empathy and trying to think about those different perspectives and how that might relate to understanding the ethics of something. And I think in the second example, this movement away from just ethics as setting up an experiment correctly or not making up data toward this idea of asking questions and interrogating, and also toward this kind of potentiality. And that really brings me back to that myth of unanticipated consequences, that they're starting to think, well, it's not just the ideal or the intention, it's actually, you know, responsibility isn't trying to really think about all of the different kinds of things that might happen and engaging that in some way. And that is, of course, what we're going for. Obviously, like anything that you try, some students are more responsive than other students. I think one thing that's been I think really great with CAER is that it tends to be very engaging and students tend to have fun, and that helps. And it also really leverages the ways that they can learn from each other. So if you have enough students who are actually engaged, who did do the reading, and they're in groups where they're doing this with each other, it can kind of rub off and help with the students who might have either struggled with the reading or didn't engage with it as much, because there's this kind of group work that we usually do it in groups.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and going back to the assessment piece, we did our best based on these particular case studies, but we still have a lot more assessment that we can do. We have stacks of pre and post assessment sheets, asking students, what does responsible innovation mean to you, for example? So kind of a tweak of the question that Emily has at the top of this slide. And so, you know, there's all sorts of different ways to, you know, kind of weave this stuff throughout your class. And so you can actually do a pre and post at the beginning of your class and at the end of your class, or you know, just at the beginning of a single class session, for example, such as what you're seeing in this slide, which is essentially a gamified version of essentially what Emily just walked us through regarding autonomous vehicles and the different elements that autonomous vehicles might encompass. And so basically what students do is they go through a number of slides, and they use random number generators to select different elements from each of these artifacts, and they build their story along the way, and ultimately they end up creating a design fiction and interrogating that design fiction via ethical frameworks. So, and also just to note that this original structure was actually created, the game was created by Chase Collins, one of our, you know, our original, one of our original STS Futures Lab students. And so
he wanted to, if I could just jump in, he wanted to run a workshop with the rest of the students on his capstone project, which was a really big capstone project that year, like 8 students. And so he problem solved that and said, you know, I think we need a gamified version. And we said, cool, you know, what do you, and so he started developing that. So we're moving now into the part of the talk, which we'll probably go through relatively quickly, just so that we have time for questions and discussion, but to talk about some of the different contexts and ways that we've adapted it for different amounts of time, and maybe mostly the same learning objectives. But one thing that I've experimented with is doing, well, we've both done final class projects. I've experimented with longer class, like 3 to 4 week at the, you know, projects where groups are doing research around a topic, and going through several iterations of scenario analysis, and then really spending some time with their design fiction, where the final class project or the final exam is a kind of poster session with their design fictions, and each of the teams has to present their design fiction, and the other team has to try to come up with as many things as a team who designed it never thought of. and so they go in kind of these quick sessions, but it's also paired with individual reflections and write-ups. So the basic outline of this is also in the Google Drive, outlining, you know, how the assignment was set up and what the deliverables were. But this was one of the first times that we experimented with it. And when the students first started with this, it was like, why is it sort of arts and crafts? Like, you know, they're not prototyping technologies, they're prototyping forms of life. but very quickly, every time I got to the classroom, they were lined up out there waiting for me with smiles on their faces, just like ready to go in there. And, and so we often talk about it in terms of this kind of serious play. And the real learning is happening primarily in interaction with each other as they're trying to think about what's plausible and why. And as the sort of accidents of making happen that force them to kind of think through what the form of life might be or why. So there's a lot of movement from their initial design, which I have them articulate. They have a design that they've written out, and then they actually start making it. And usually there's some shift that happens over the course of making that reflects more discussion and thinking. And then, of course, afterwards, as they're discussing with each other.
Mm-hmm. So this might be a little bit more oriented towards the students in the audience, as well as those who advise student research projects in the context that you can actually empower students to use these tools in pretty wildly different ways to dig into their capstone and really think about things that they've never thought about before, as Emily was saying on the previous slide. So if we could just go to the next one. So actually, yeah, go back to the, sorry about that, master of slides. So here we have Josh and Lauren, who were working on a waste management capstone project, specifically focusing on political economies around waste management, given the ban on a number of recyclables in China. And so the US, has a lot of, recyclable materials that it can't really do anything with. So that's kind of where their project started. And it ended up evolving into this wonderful engagement with experts across the board, policy-oriented experts to experts who run recycling centers and so on and so forth. And in fact, Lauren actually got her job because of this, because of the connections that she made doing this. And so yeah, you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So yeah, the official title, focusing on kind of municipal solid waste management, and again, trying to engage those industry professionals. And so, this is just an example of the many different types of experts that they engaged with. And we can go to the next one. And if we go to the second the last two bullet points, one of the main reasons that they conducted the interviews, other than to get more robust information from the people who are really on the ground, was to analyze develop drivers. So to develop drivers for scenario analysis. And so they went through I can't even tell you how many different scenario crosses they created and the amount of analysis that they did. But they essentially used the interviews in conjunction with the scenario crosses that they developed, along with a design fiction that they developed to provide recommendations for what can be done on the municipal level. And then they brought what they had done back to the experts they had interviewed. And so it started a dialogue, so it doesn't just end, it can really start a dialogue. And I think that's what really impressed Lauren's current employer, which is a recycling company down in Roanoke. And then the other really cool thing that they did was they wanted to focus on public engagement in some way, shape, or form. And I went to a presentation at Arizona State University. It was SNET. It was the one where Chase and I presented on the work that we did, and he got to finally meet Langdon Winter. But there was a session about science tarot, and I became so entranced by the idea. And so this was Cynthia Celine's group that I was like, we gotta do this, but we gotta like basically make it another kind of gamified version of scenario analysis. And so yeah, essentially they created driver cards, key event cards, and lenses, which were essentially kind of, ethical reasoning types of questions, societal questions about who wins and loses, and these potential waste management futures. And yeah, so that was a lot of fun, and they actually tested it out in a couple of sections of my classes, and my students still talk about it to this day. And you can see that it was on Halloween. I gave my students extra credit if they dressed up in a outfit related to a topic in the class. And so these guys were bananas because we were talking about agriculture at the time. But you can, the young lady on the right side is a farmer. But you can see how the cards are spread out, and basically students are creating stories by selecting different cards. And what Lauren and Josh did was lead them through this particular protocol of when you draw a particular card, etc. And basically at the end of the activity, the students had to role play journalists who were living in this world, and they had to create headlines and kind of a bulleted news article along with a picture, which was actually a design fiction from this particular world with its particular issues. And so it was a really cool capstone, and I think it kind of blew a lot of us away. And we have it recorded in case anyone wants to check it out. But anyways, I think
jump in to say something, Shannon.
yeah.
I wanted to go back to Beth's question, because I think one of the things that we're always looking to do when we can is have our students teach other students. And so whenever there's students that are more like really getting into it, like Josh and Lauren, they ended up really diving into this for their research project, and then they're coming into the classroom and leading. So they're getting the experience, that learning experience of authoring all of this, right? Really taking it into a different dimension. But then the students that they're in these classes are also, there's something different about them learning from the other students, and that we have some other
remembered it. Yeah, I think that's why they really remembered it.
Okay, we need to probably pick it up so that
we're getting there. So this is just some examples of the design fictions that Lauren and Josh put together. So this was another project where students were working on an artificial leaf project meant to produce hydrogen energy. And this is just an example of one of the scenario analysis boards they were doing. They were focusing on island economies and having the technology actually floating in the salt water, because they needed salt water to actually do its thing. And so they were also obviously being led by a technical advisor, as you can see by my very technical language explaining how the technology works. But we can go to the next slide. So they were focusing on, again, back to, we're fangirls and fanboys of Langdon Winter over here. And so these students really got into thinking about kind of energy and politics, and centralized energy versus decentralized energy, authoritative technologies versus democratic technologies. And so in these design fictions, they're essentially trying to imagine what a centralized technology versus a decentralized implementation of the technology would look like. And then here's just kind of like their idealized, their ideal scenario.
Okay, so, and I just want to acknowledge, I see, Beth, your other questions, and I think we should have time to come back to those in a second. So one of the things that's been kind of interesting, we talked about how CAER sort of developed alongside the development of the Futures Lab. We started realizing that CAER is a kind of way through to do a kind of critical participation with our STEM colleagues as well as our STEM students. And so we started this workshop series to invite experts from different disciplines into the lab to do CAER with them. And so here our students become co-facilitators of doing CAER with experts from different disciplines. And I guess I'm going to mute this, but this is a little montage. And so we've had, Dr. Benton came in to talk about gender equity in IT education. Dr. Merton came in from geography to talk about infrastructure in Nepal. We've done it with, people more in STEM fields, but initially we were just thinking about science and engineering. And then we thought really any kind of expertise, it raises different kinds of questions. So we've had David Tomlin and Nicole Mogul, who are STS people, come in. It was a very different flavor of co-imagining futures, as you might imagine, but in all the cases, the students are facilitators. And when we first started doing this, we imagined that the students were really there just to learn from the experts, I guess. But what we found pretty quickly when we really after the very first one, and it's subsequently, we keep seeing this because we video all of this, is that the students are really central to doing this work. And it's allowed us to start thinking about CAER as a research methodology, and to really think about kind of undoing these boundaries, or not, maybe not undoing, but rethinking and challenging these boundaries between pedagogy and engagement and research, and finding what kinds of interesting things happen when we don't think of those as being in separate boxes, which I think for many of us who are very invested in our teaching spaces, I think it's kind of a nice opportunity to explore that, and to explore the creativity of it, and the possibilities and the openness that our teaching is informing our research, and that what's happening in these spaces kind of resists or defies those kinds of walls between those different kinds of activities. And then it also becomes another example of the students kind of authoring through CAER, or having agency in how they do this and how they help co-facilitate these workshops.
I think that might address a little bit of Beth's question about how they make connections, how do they think about next steps, essentially professional development. And one of the really neat things about this is that our students become co-researchers in it. They're all listed on the IRB as co-researchers. And we had an invited expert focused on precision medicine. And through that engagement, we actually did, like a 13-person co-authored article in a practitioner's journal focused on genetics. So, there are ways where students can use these opportunities to bolster their resume, to think about whether they want to go into a particular field, and it can be a little bit helpful in helping them think about those next steps, especially when they end up being a published peer-reviewed author. Not fully answering the question, but there are opportunities that can emerge from this sort of thing.
And then I think, just to get to being able to use the rest of the time for discussion, I'm just going to wave at this. We've also explored using these in this CAER and other kinds of workshops, designing a game, and then finally, we have a capstone student now who is wanted to he wanted to develop some kind of app for his capstone, but was really interested in the social context. And we said, well, we do this thing called CAER, and it would be super cool if we had an app for that. So we're now working with him, and now he's actually leading a whole software, like an agile software development class, that are now part of his team to develop this app together. So it's kind of interesting because it not only, there's on some level, all of them have to start engaging with the CAER process and understanding it a little bit, even though they're not fully immersed in it, just because now they're doing the storyboarding and starting to program it. But also we hope that this will be a tool that we can share with folks that, you know, you'd be able to kind of say, oh, I want to do CAER with like X topic, and you would have a nice front end to be able to add in some stuff, or you could have students use it. You could use it basically in all these contexts, use it to structure a research project, use it for a single class, use it for a workshop, look at the data and analyze it and see what's happening, and that also could be interesting for assessment. So we're starting to work on that. We started that we started last spring.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the slides are in the Drive folder, so you can see the references there. And going back to Beth's questions about, so you talked about supporting students moving into the professional world. And so some of it is starting to see, and I think this is also helping us to see STS as not like, yes, there's rich theoretical contributions that STS makes, but also trying to look for that kind of the actionability of STS, the ways in which STS provides also a kind of tool set and things that they can take. So actually our student Chase also basically used all of this work with CAER to get his first job, which was working at Quantico, doing in like Navy training,
Focusing on
technology of the future training, something like this, something very relevant. In other cases, it becomes like using STS to think about like expertise and interpretive flexibility becomes a way, I guess what I'm trying to say is that we try to connect the kind of theoretical orientations with skills, and that goes back to that idea, that context of development, which is hands-on, real world, all of that, right? It's trying to find the ways that it's grounded in helping them to do innovation, I guess, better, and then translate those skills into potentially jobs. And then going back to the training, the students training each other. Another example of that in an upper division class with holistic problem solving was to have students develop workshops on holistic problem solving to take into other classes and do guest lectures with activities. That wasn't specifically CAER, but it was the same kind of idea. We're always trying to find those opportunities for them to move into that role as actually partly a professionalization move, partially a learning move. Was that you, Shannon, that you were adding something?
Oh, yeah, just a quick addition. So I get to see all 100 members of our junior class on a weekly basis for our junior capstone process, which the capstone process is actually a 2-year process in our program. And so I'm able to kind of inflect a little bit of kind of the STS thinking and promote social context work in combination with the technical work. And we demonstrate, videos such as Lauren and Josh's and other students, in which we can see how the STS work, the scenario work, the design fiction work actually helped make the project much stronger. Because, in some cases students had to reach out to experts that they might not otherwise have done, or whatever it might be. And so we also do professional development in that class. And so we emphasize like your capstone goes like at the top of your resume. Basically, after you say ABET accredited, like the next thing is your capstone. And you highlight, that you can move between these worlds, because that's oftentimes what employers are looking for. Especially when people move up the chain, they're looking for people who understand people as well as, understand the technical know-how.
And I wanted to pick up on Jessica's question. Thank you. I would say, so the question is about to what extent do we trouble the term stakeholder in the lab? And there's probably a variation on this in terms of how much we trouble it in our other classes versus the lab proper, where we have a much smaller cohort of students that are really in. But I would say that we trouble it only in the same way that we trouble innovation. So we basically recognize that this is the term that everyone's using in our space. So when I first joined JMU and I came in as like, oh, not that word, innovation, because of all the reasons. And then it's like, okay, this is the word that travels here. So what can we do with that, right? And so this with stakeholder, I personally don't do so much to trouble the term directly, but in using CAER, we are always coming back to questions of inclusion and exclusion. And we have had robust discussions about also human, non-human, where we draw these boundaries around CAER. Questions, I was just talking about this with one of my classes the other day about when they use the term the public, what does that mean? And talking about why we might say publics. And so, so there's lots of different kind of entry points, but it's not so much coming right out and saying we're going to challenge stakeholder per se, because it's so deeply ingrained and so much taken up in all of their classes with all of our colleagues, right? So I don't know, that's my answer.
Yeah, and sometimes, I'll pose the question as they're trying to kind of think about who are the quote unquote stakeholders or communities or whatever. I pose the question, okay, so let's just kind of take a step back and think about who are the winners and losers in this particular situation, in this particular scenario. And for some reason that really gets them thinking, like who comes out on top, who is negatively affected. And, so it's not a terribly intellectually engaging question, but it seems to do the job sometimes, thinking about the winners and the losers in a particular scenario.
The other thing, this is kind of, I don't know, been on my mind, both in terms of the ESTS journal, but also Shannon and I just worked on a special issue for responsible innovation, and we invited a bunch of shorter perspective pieces. And I think that these are really great for teaching in the kinds of spaces we're in. And so this class I've already assigned this semester, I've assigned 2 of these. They're intellectually rigorous, but they're not inaccessible, and they're relatively short. And so these, one of the articles was by Rebecca Monteleone?
Yeah.
Around Forgotten Publics, Engaging Disability and Responsible Innovation. And the other one was by Damian Williams, looking at anti-Black surveillance technologies and raising the question of what if the responsible thing is just to stop innovating, rather than how do we innovate more responsibly? And so both, I thought the students engaged with those really well. I took Shannon's juicy quotes and put it, we use the Mentimeter a lot now that we're on Zoom, with juicy quotes as ways to start those kinds of conversations. And that's been pretty good.
Yeah.
So.
Any other questions or thoughts or complaints or concerns? Challenges. We're very effervescent and excited about all of this stuff, in case you can't tell.
But I promise it's not just about us. We mostly wanted to say, hey, here's something that you could play with and you could modify and you could use it in different ways. And when you do, like, let us know what new ideas did you have about things that, ways that you've been able to integrate this or modify in some way or improve it in some way. It's like I said, we didn't invent, obviously, any of the tools in the toolbox. I think that we just found that this is a flexible arrangement that is really powerful.
Mm-hmm.
I actually had a question about, first of all, thank you so much for this presentation. This was, I'm going to be using some of the tools in that folder, I think, soon. But I am a huge fan of unexpected consequences, of thinking about unexpected consequences. So what are some of the unexpected consequences of the Futures Lab and of CAER?
Oh, that's a juicy one. You see how
the fact that it exists was a big one. And that's a good question about the curriculum. Honestly, space is a real challenge, a real issue. It's highly sought after and limited. And so the fact that we were able to get this big, beautiful space We don't take it for granted. We don't think we'll just have it forever if we don't use it well. So I think there is that, but I think actually just the being able to get it and have it, and knowing that our dean and the chair of our department supports it. Now, you know, we invited both of them into the lab to do this with us, and I think that actually was really has been very effective, and kind of in them seeing that this is powerful and engaged, and they put it on the tours for like something that's distinctive about how ISAT does social context, that because it has this kind of lab hands-on kind of space. So that's been surprising in a really good way. And the other big surprise was about the role of students in our Co-Imagining Futures project, but maybe Shannon has other things that have been surprising in the lab.
Surprising. I've just loved that students have been interested, you know, that there are, you know, students who want to hang out with us. Typically we meet on a Friday and talk about, you know, STS canon, or, you know, develop individual projects, or submit abstracts for conferences. And I mean, it's been mind-blowing, and it's just been wonderful to get to know these students so well. You know, the fact that we already have a graduated cohort, a couple of years of graduated cohort, just means that, you know, there are more alumni to touch base with, and, you know, that we have really, really tight connections with, that, you know, I'm sure we'll be pulling back into the lab for guest talks and stuff in the future. But to just have those relationships that sometimes you just don't get in the 100-person class. And, you know, like, I don't necessarily get it on Zoom with my 25-person class, but, you know, we still get it to a significant extent, even though the Futures Lab is online this semester. Just that close connection with the students.
And kind of bringing that to this question about the curriculum. I mean, part of our sell on the lab is that we can't just say it's only for the 10 to 15 students. We have to, you know, we have to develop the tools and practices there that then go into all of our classes, and we are finding ways to bring students from our classes into there, and, like, you know, creating and bringing experts in, and trying to get external funding, and doing things that help, you know, continue to validate it. In terms of how the lab, so we are just now actually in the process of getting an official course number that isn't like the independent study course number for it. And that we've done it for now a couple of years before we actually have made that move. And so part of that is now having it count for the STS minor, allowing it to count. So ISAT students have a pretty robust curriculum. They don't have a lot of space in their classes, but they concentrate in one of 6 areas. They can co-concentrate with social contexts. So this can count toward that co-concentration, along with, you know, they can concentrate in energy or computing, or there's a bunch of different areas. The faculty, just in ISAT alone, what is it, like 30 faculty? And I think in all of CIS it's like over 40. Everybody has a PhD in a different field. The vast majority are natural sciences and engineering degrees, but there's also social scientists, law, you know, various, and there's a team of us, which is nice. I mean, Shannon and I are on the social context team. It's not just the 2 of us. So the curriculum is designed so that there's a foundation 100 and 200 level courses in the natural sciences, technology, and then a couple of social context courses. And then at the 300 level, they do a holistic problem solving sequence, which is supposed to integrate social and technical. And then they do this capstone, which is a 2-year process, which is also supposed to integrate social context. So we have really been proponents of saying STS. So now they know that that's STS. They used to only call it social context, but we said, no, it's the STS Futures Lab. And, you know, so we've popularized that more. But so there's a lot of opportunities within that context to kind of insert the social context. Although sometimes there's anxieties among our colleagues that our curriculum isn't, you know, is it losing some of its technical depth, those kinds of things, you know, those dialogues and discussions happen.
or that we're like siloing ourselves, but yeah, in general, like I think us and our students are pretty good ambassadors in terms of inviting other faculty, maybe more technically oriented students to participate in the types of work that we do. And the really cool thing with the co-imagining futures is that we get to reach out to our technical faculty and bring them in and all learn together about their particular expertise. And so it's not without its, you know, a little political here's and there's and that sort of thing. But, you know, in general, you know, Dean, speaking to your question as Emily did, yeah, I think it fits. You know, it's become part of the culture. You know, now that we've been building it up for a couple of years. So yeah, it's never perfect, but you know,
So much more work to do.
Yeah,
including just continuing to develop the way, you know, how all of the questions you guys asked are such good questions. And I know that they're coming from being in very similar spaces where these are challenging things to do. And we don't have all the answers, that's for sure. So next time, we want to hear from more about all your great ideas so that we can adopt them.
Thank you very much. We want to thank our great speakers, Emily and Shannon, for this wonderful talk, very engaging. I'm sure we have a lot of takeaways. And also thanks so much to my dear colleague, Stevie Ray, for moderating the questions and answers, and also organizing the whole lecture series. And also thanks to everybody here who during this busy time and it's our talk today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming and for having us.
We really appreciate it. And thanks all for burning the evening oil.
I'm sure a lot of us would be interested in taking some of your tools, exercise, and implement in our own classes. And Minds and Jem, you actually share a lot of interest in integrated approaches to ethics education. I'm hoping in the future both of you would be interested in developing some sort of like a handbook or guideline for people who are interested in integrating these pedagogies in the classroom. But I really appreciate your pioneering work and scholarship. Well, thank you for joining us today, and Emily and Shannon. We look forward to hearing from you soon. And
thanks so much.
Thank you.